Hello, I'm Jennifer Keller, the programming coordinator at the Westport Library. Today, we're speaking with Westport author Bonnie Adler in this Saugatuck Scribes virtual event. This series celebrates authors who live or grew up in Westport. Bonnie Adler, the author of Life Goes On, Thankfully, was a reporter for the Westport Minuteman for 14 years, covering all sorts of news, and wrote 2 columns called Mindscapes and Dear Bonnie, as well as a variety of feature stories. Jan Bassin is a writing teacher, program designer, and event planner in the literary arts. She is the founder and director of the Writers' Workshop at the Westport Center for Senior Activities, where she serves as coordinator of writing programs. So I would like to greet both Bonnie and Jan at this time and send this over to them.
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you. Thank you for doing this.
Hi, Jan. Hi, Jan.
Hi, Bonnie. I'm so glad we're here today. Another one of these wonderful Zoom events during this really interesting period of history. And I feel fortunate that we can do this way. I also think that the timing for this book is actually great. I know most authors would not think that their book coming out at the end of February of 2020 is essentially great timing, but I think this is really interesting timing. I think that when you have global, national tragedies, crises, they are these change points in history that often ask us to step into changes within our own personal lives. And I think that that's something that your book, Life Goes On, thankfully speaks to, because while all this is going on around us, we still live in our own bodies and in our own lives, and other personal things happen to us, and things are brought into question. So I will congratulate you on your timing for this book, because I think it will resonate with people right now.
That's a very positive way of looking at a very difficult time.
Very difficult time. I think that maybe your main character, the character who is the source of this biographical memoir, as you call it, and I'll ask you to speak to that in a minute, would maybe think of it that way also. There is an event that happens in this book, and he would cite 9/11 as a real change point in his own life and in encountering his own self. And that's something that comes up here as well. So, so that our audience knows what we're talking about, explain this form. It's Life Goes On, Thankfully, the riveting story of a family man living a traditional life until a secret and a diagnosis change everything. A biographical memoir of Richard Heimler as told to Bonnie Adler. So explain to the audience what that is.
I chose to call it a biographical memoir because I had the very unusual and sad experience of becoming very involved with Richard and his story. But Richard was not able to give me a final go-ahead on the story. And so because of that, I had to make a lot of independent decisions about how we were going to tell the story that he wanted so badly to be told. So I wanted to call it a memoir, but but since it wasn't written by Richard Heimler and it was written by me, I wanted to make a distinction.
Right, which is wonderful.
That is the reason why I called it an autobiographical memoir. And I got the idea because one of my favorite authors, who is Oliver Sacks, a famed neurosurgeon who people usually know from Awakenings, he was a very prolific writer, but at the time of his, he got cancer, and at the time when he became very sick, at the end he asked somebody else, even though he had written 10 books, he asked somebody else, Leonard Wexler, I believe is his name, to write his book. And he called it, his book, an autobiographical memoir. And I said, great, that's what I'm going to do.
That's
also, I just, I needed some distance. I needed to make it his story written by me.
And from the brief conversation you and I had, he entrusted you with his story. He asked you to be the author of his story, or his co-pilot with this story. So he shows you, there's a lot of discussion now, rightfully so, about who has the right to tell someone else's story for them, especially a person in a very different life situation, right? And so the fact, I mean, I think that's something interesting to tell. You started writing a different book. So you want to speak to that for a minute?
I love writing about secrets. And I was very involved. I had planned, as we just heard, I was a reporter for a very long time and used to writing short pieces. And I was very comfortable with that. And I had a plan to write short pieces about different people's secrets. And way back when, I was also a therapist, a psychiatric nurse therapist, and I learned how to interview people, and I honed that craft when I became a reporter. And one of my favorite things about being a reporter was really listening to people so that I could understand their story. But I was really interested in the topic of secrets, and I had about 5 wonderful stories that I was already engaged with and looking for more. And when I ran into Richard Heimler, who was my old friend, I knew right then and there, because he introduced me to he told me he was married and he was just getting used to using the word husband. So I knew that he had a lifelong secret. And I also was such good friends with him that I immediately remembered how much I loved him, and I asked him to come to my house, and we met because we both live in Connecticut, and I kind of fell in love with him all over again. And I asked him if I could write his secret, and he said, "Yes, you can. I never say no when I can say yes." So that was how we began. And we would meet. But then when we started meeting, I understood that his life was so complex and very interesting. And he had been such a integral part of so many people's lives and was such a beloved person. His life was really rich and very complicated. And I asked him if he would let me write his memoir, because I was trying to sink my teeth into something which I knew was a riveting story. And he said, "No, you can't. I want my story, and I'm going to write my own book." And I said, "Okay." But anyway, so we kept meeting about his secret so I could write his secret, which was that he was a gay man living a closeted life. And then one day, he really enjoyed our interviews, and so did I. And then one day he said to me, "I changed my mind. I really want you to write my story. It's way too hard to do this myself." And I was like, "Yes." And then we were off to the races.
How great is that?
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
I will confess that I didn't really know what I was getting into. His life was very emotional and very beautiful. And he had many interests. He loved Broadway. He loved his family. He had friends everywhere. He was deeply interested in the Jewish word for volunteerism and making the world a better place, which is called Tikkun Olam. And he had a multifaceted life that was extraordinary to me, especially given the challenges that he faced in his life.
Well, I think there's a universal quality to his story, and I think it was generous of him to share it and generous of you to help get it out there, because it's a story about facing fear, right? Facing fear, love, and connection. I mean, and living your most authentic, best life while honoring the people you love. And that is something that, it means a lot to me in terms of a memoir. It's vulnerable, and you take us through his life in such an interesting way. We get to know Richard from the time he's a little boy. It's a portrait in this way of his whole life, right? We get to know him from the time he's a little boy. So we begin to understand how and why he makes decisions that he makes in his life and where they come from. And then, good reporter that you are, you know, you give us this scope. But a little bit in terms of the form of this book. You know, you had this very large personality with two, the book is about two sort of trajectories in life, right? And you had to decide, how am I best going to represent this, right? I mean, there were a lot of choices there. So you have original letters, so first person documents. You have probably what was the culmination of lots and lots of interview sessions written in his voice. You have your own voice. You have links to internet, to things on the internet that illuminate even more. So you want to talk about, as a writer, how hard was this?
I will say, I hate to say anything slightly negative, but I would say that writing this book was one of the hardest things that I've ever done. I didn't realize how difficult. It's not like being a reporter and writing a story. When you write a book, it's a completely different genre. So I did have many, many choices to make. And I wanted to be as honest, and I wanted to honor Richard in every way that I could, because I felt that his life, his childhood stories were so beautiful, and all he really wanted was to, he had this mantra. He wanted to be the perfect little boy. He wanted to be the best little boy in the world. And he was motivated that way when he was a child. So I have these lovely stories about all of the people in his life that he was in love with, and those love affairs, like the one with his grandmother, who treated him so beautifully, and his grandfather, where he felt he was in his own little circle of love when he went to visit them. He wanted to replicate that throughout his life. So much of the book is a story about his attempts to gain love, and to be the perfect companion, find the perfect love and be that person. In fact, that is really his compelling wish from page 1 until the end of the book. And I would say that he succeeded at that. And it was a fascinating trip to take with him, to learn about all the people who loved him and who he loved back.
So Bonnie, would you, just grace us with this a little bit? Would you read a little bit from the introduction, sort of whet our appetites for sort of what we're about to encounter in this book?
So this part is, in the very beginning, there's my voice as I introduce the story, and my own feelings about writing are here. I was afraid of so much truthfulness and moved by the strength it took for him to speak with as much honesty as he could muster. I was concerned that I would out him, hurt him by telling the unvarnished details of his life. But I also knew that Richard's story had become important not just to him, but to his family, who urged him to continue his quest to share his tale with the world. And so I resolved to continue, no matter how difficult it might be. The following pages are Richard's story as he told it to me, an intoxicating tale of laughter, love, sex, money, and ultimately of strength and human dignity. I am honored to have collaborated with him on it.
It's a beautiful, beautiful introduction. And your voice appears at the beginning of this book, and again at the end of this book, sort of the bookends of the book, the frame of the book in a way, which is really nice. But the rest is written in memoir, first person memoir form, given to you, voice given to you by Richard. And he read a lot of a lot of this, right? I mean, he knew what was going on throughout in terms of using his voice and what he wanted in. I mean, there was that real collaboration as you went through this.
Yes, I wanted him to be happy with I wanted to fulfill my responsibility. I cared very much that I respected who he is and was able to portray him. And he loved what I wrote. And that gave me the impetus to continue, because eventually it became harder and harder. We would meet and he would tell me his stories, and I would understand how much torture he experienced during his coming out process and then on during the rest of his life. And I would need time alone. I never experienced anything like it. I would need time alone to just recover from the intensity of the experience. There was so much honesty and pain, also a lot of laughter. Right. But when a person really reveals, a person who suffered as much as he did, and can share that, I needed time to just absorb it so that I could tell the story honestly and give him the credit which I believed he deserved.
Yeah, I think
and I will say, I think I was able to do that because his mother, who he adored and is a character in the story, she's very much in the story, and a very bright woman who was a different kind of a mom than a lot of people had in Long Island in the 1960s.
Sure.
Anyway, she told me, was one of my great compliments. She said to me, Richard was lucky that he met you because I hear his voice in every word. And that was a great compliment.
The best compliment ever. And you know, there's something about Richard when you read your book, Richard's book, the book you put together, you do feel like you've known him for a very long time. You get to feel like, at least I did as a reader, get to know him. And there's something of his spirit, despite the adversity he lived with, and a tremendous amount of from a privileged position, which he acknowledges all over. He's very grateful for a privileged position he was born into in many ways. Didn't stop the adversity that came and the difficulties or the challenges he faced through the two things. And Bonnie and I are speaking somewhat cryptically because there is a little bit of, we don't want to reveal where the story goes, because you get to learn in a way as Richard's going through it, since we don't have crystal balls for our own lives, right? You get to experience life as Richard is going through it in your book, in the way you chose to do this. So I don't want to blow it for the readers in that way, but there's something of Richard's excitement and zeal and zest, I don't know what other words you want to use for life in general, that just jumps off the pages here. And he has this one little part, and I hope I can just read now your words and his words. And he says, sometimes I wish I could have a timeout like we give our kids. I need to figure out what I've done wrong and what I can do to fix it and set things right again. But there is no timeout. I am here on this journey in uncharted waters, but I am determined to find a way somehow. I have been so lucky in my life. Dare I dream I can create a new path and not lose the people I love and who love me? I have no illusions. I know the way would be calamitous in the beginning, but I also want to believe that I can find a happy ending despite the odds and despite my fears. And I have chills as I read that, because who can't relate to that at some point in their life, right? And happy endings, he talks about happy endings a lot. That must have been something he said over and over to you, about wanting a happy ending. Like the Broadway musicals he loved that very often had happy endings. He truly believed in that, no?
He wanted to believe that life could be a fairy tale and that everybody could live happily ever after. I mean, he was a Broadway glutton. And he loved a happy ending. There's some parts of the story when he was a little boy. He got his grandmother, who he loved, to take him to see Hello, Dolly. And there's a scene in Hello, Dolly when the parade goes down the street. And he reported back to me that when he was about 8 or 9, during that scene, he stood up, he jumped up from his seat in the theater, and he saluted because he was so taken by the show. And he, in fact, that was something that lasted with him forever. He was that gay man who loved Broadway. And, you can write a whole other book about what that's about. But
he also, that core belief in everyone deserving happiness, because I think that comes through. I'm gonna quote something, and then you please turn my negative into a positive. So maybe you can speak to your book cover a little bit, even, please turn my negative into a positive.
Oh, well, I don't want to give the book away. So there's,
yeah, I think there's a way to do that without giving the book. What do you think?
Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn the book on this side, and I'm going to encourage the readers and the viewers to take a look, because here we have a picture of Richard's in each one of these pictures in all of his very, very, all of the wonderful ways that he loved to be. So he was, by the way, here's a picture of him when this was actually, I think this was taken when he got married to his wife when he was in his 20s. And his wife, by the way, happened to be one of my best friends when I had originally met him, which is another reason why the story was so compelling to me and why I so wanted to honor the story. I wanted to be truthful and tell Richard's story, but I had been friends with his wife. My daughter had been friends with his daughter. And I wanted to honor those friendships, and I wanted to tell the truth in a way that might be painful, but that was true and would represent the truth and the facts about what actually happened in a way that would, nobody would be disappointed or hurt that the story was told. There's always a terrible way to say something. There's a wonderful way to say something. So that was my
but I think that really echoed his honoring and respect, which comes through from the stories we get from the time he's a little boy. He makes friendships and connections and with unlikely people. There are a lot of unlikely friendships that happen in this book, which is wonderful because of his honoring and his commitment to seeing things in the better light.
He was very funny. He was very funny. He had a very wicked sense of humor. And when you say he made unlikely connections, he absolutely did. And there was one story when he, before he came, he went into his family business, which is another really interesting aspect of the story, because I think a lot of people have a lot of thoughts about what is that like. You're so lucky you're going into a family business, but it was, it's complicated. And so he was in the costume jewelry business, and he had a buyer in the days, it's like 25 years ago. So in the days before the internet, he had this buyer who was about 25 years older than him. And he loved people of all ages. He had absolutely no...
Right. Totally not an ageist of any kind. You saw that.
No, you could be a child, you could be a teen, you could be an old person. He didn't care. And he had long lists of people he called every day, by the way. So anyway, there was this one time he took his buyer out for dinner, and he had to go, he took her home, and she lived in a building with an elevator at the top or whatever. So he said he was brought up to take people, not just to their door, not to the doorman, but right up to the apartment. So he gets in the elevator with her, and there's another person in the elevator, a man who's older, probably about his friend's age. And the fellow is staring at them, thinking, who are these people and what are they doing together? This very handsome young man and this older woman. And Richard looks at the fellow and he goes, you know what we're doing, right? We're just about to have a really, really fabulous evening. And the woman said, don't listen to him. He's my nephew, which was also not true. And she was, of course, used to his humor. She knew he embarrassed her, but she didn't really care. Anyway, so from then on in, whenever this gentleman in the elevator saw the lady, he would say to her, how's your nephew?
Right? Right. Yeah, and there are so many of these moments in this book. So I want to ask you this question. Every writer has in their heads an ideal reader or a number of ideal readers, because, you know, and you are a reporter, there's an audience here, and I think I have an idea in my head of all the kinds of people who I think I would want to read this book. Who do you want to read this book? If we had hashtags, Bonnie,
right,
you know, what would we say?
Well, of course, there are two main parts in the book. And so the first would be coming out. So today things are a little looser than they used to be, but when Richard came out, he was over 40. So you have that entire audience of people who have lived a secret life and then finally get the courage to come out. So there's gay lit, there's the literature of people who struggle with their sexuality and then come to a conclusion and open up about it. So there's that. There's a tremendous amount, there's a lot of this Judaism in the book and what it means, although not that much. And there's a lot about illness and how illness can affect your life. Mm-hmm. And of course, how profoundly it can affect your life. And then there is also the most beautiful thing, which is the love stories, you know, wanting love and what is love and how do you connect with somebody? And when you do, how wonderful it is. And then what do you do when the love dies and it doesn't work out? And how do you pick yourself up and go on? So this, above all, is the story of someone who met many, many, many challenges and overcame so many of them and managed to do it in a way that, you know, he was a beautiful person who was able to do that. And one of the ways I'm going to say it is that I was thinking about something that he told me recently about decision making and how do you make, because he was so smart. And he said to me, you know, how do you make a decision? And then he talked about regrets, because of course he had many, many regrets. But he said, I've learned that you can only make the best decision with the facts that you have at the time. You think, you ponder, and then you decide. And if it turns out that you were wrong, you can't really blame yourself because you made the best decision you could when you had to make it. And I think that is a gift. That's one of those many gifts. Because if you think about how many times you've regretted doing something, it's usually because you found out later that there was additional information, but you didn't know it at the time. So
yeah, and Bonnie, I think that's really important because the grappling with self-acceptance is a big, big, big theme in this book, right? And that love, and then making sure you don't harm people or try your best not to harm people along the way. So there's a lot of kindness here and mindfulness and all of the things where we're being told that we need to be thinking about right now.
I'd like to add one other thing. Mm-hmm. And this is about the time in which we're living. And that is that I think that this book is an easy read. And that's because people who've read it have told me that. And I think these days it's so difficult to concentrate. We have so many difficult things that we're living with that I would like to encourage people who are looking for a book that they can't put down to consider reading Life Goes On, Thankfully, because it really is a page turner. Yeah. And I'm only saying that because other people have told me. How about that?
It's a very accessible book, and it will resonate in ways in your own life that are unexpected. That's what I think. It's inspiring. It's really inspiring. So thank you for the hard work, which I know putting together something like this was, and for sharing Richard's life with everyone.
You're very welcome. And I will say, I'll plug my book. If you are looking to buy it, you just go on Amazon. It's available through Amazon. Life Goes On, Thankfully, an autobiographical memoir of Richard Heimler as told to Bonnie Adler.
Great. Thank you both so much for sharing your time with us today, Bonnie and Jan. And for those of you at home, yes, you too can order the book, or you can borrow it from the library. And for more videos and information about the Westport Library, please be sure to visit westportlibrary.org. Thank you both again for your time.
Thank you.
Much.